Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own home, drifting through the hallways of your childhood while the world around you remained completely unaware of your presence? You were there physically, your seat at the dinner table was occupied, and your school attendance was recorded, but your internal world, your fears, and your triumphs went completely unnoticed by those tasked with caring for you. Psychology calls this childhood emotional neglect, a silent form of trauma that leaves no physical evidence and no visible scars, yet fundamentally alters the landscape of your adult personality. It occurs when a caregiver fails to respond sufficiently to a child's emotional needs, creating a void where validation and guidance should have been. As a child, you likely learned that being quiet, self-sufficient, and making absolutely no demands was the safest and most efficient way to exist in your family dynamic. However, this survival strategy doesn't simply vanish once you reach adulthood. It evolves into a specific set of personality traits that dictate how you interact with friends, partners, and colleagues. Instead of disappearing, the invisible child becomes an adult who struggles to take up space, often feeling like an outsider even in their most intimate circles. Research suggests that those who grew up invisible share 5 distinct characteristics that define their internal and external lives. Understanding these traits is the first step toward reclaiming your voice and finally being seen for who you truly are. Today, we are exploring the psychological blueprint of invisibility and the 5 traits shared by those who grew up in the shadows. To truly understand why these adult traits are so persistent, we must first look at the neurological and psychological foundation of invisibility. Psychology shows that children rely on a process called parental attunement, where a caregiver accurately perceives and responds to a child's internal state to develop a healthy sense of self. When your emotions were consistently ignored or dismissed, your developing nervous system perceived this lack of response as a genuine threat to your survival. For a child, being unseen by a caregiver is essentially being abandoned, which triggers a chronic state of hyperarousal or deep emotional shutdown. Because you could not change your parents' behavior, you changed yourself, adapting your personality to minimize friction and ensure you remained as small as possible. This adaptation isn't just behavioral, it's structural, influencing the way your brain's prefrontal cortex manages social cues and internal sensations. Cognitive psychology suggests that if you weren't seen for who you were, you naturally began a hunt for ways to be seen for what you could provide. This search for external validation through utility is the precursor to the first, and perhaps most common trait found in invisible children. It is a compensatory mechanism designed to secure a basic sense of attachment in an environment where emotional safety was never guaranteed. Number 1. The chronic overgiver. When you grow up invisible, you internalize a devastating belief that your presence alone is not enough to merit love or attention. You feel you must constantly justify the space you occupy by being the most helpful, the most productive, or the most self-sacrificing person in the room. Psychology shows that children who feel neglected often develop a transactional view of human relationships, where love is something earned through service rather than something given freely. As an adult, this manifests as an exhausting compulsion to solve everyone else's problems while completely ignoring your own. You become the reliable one, the friend who always listens and the colleague who always picks up the slack, yet you feel a profound sense of guilt whenever the spotlight turns toward you. By making yourself indispensable to others, you are subconsciously hoping to become impossible to overlook, but the result is often the opposite. People begin to see you only for what you can do for them, further burying the person you actually are beneath a mountain of obligations. The real-life consequence is a total neglect of your personal boundaries and a slow-burning resentment toward those you are trying so hard to please. This overgiving is rooted in a psychological concept known as conditional worth. In a healthy childhood, parents act as mirrors, reflecting back the child's inherent value regardless of their behavior or achievements. However, if you only received attention when you were achieving, helping, or being good, you learned a dangerous and lasting lesson. You learned that being was not enough. You had to be doing to be noticed, and the moment you stopped doing, you feared you would once again become invisible. Cognitive psychology calls this the helper identity, where your entire self-esteem is tied to your utility to others. In adulthood, this makes you feel like an imposter whenever you aren't being productive, as if you are secretly failing at the very job of existing. You might find it nearly impossible to relax because stillness feels like a loss of value, leading to a life of perpetual motion. This prevents you from ever exploring your own desires, as your schedule is entirely dictated by the perceived needs of everyone else. When your worth is conditional, you are always one mistake away from feeling invisible again. Number 2, extreme hyperindependence. Psychology shows that hyperindependence is often a trauma response to emotional neglect, where the child decides that since no one is coming to help, they must do everything themselves. As a child, when your cries for help or comfort were ignored, you learned that dependency was synonymous with disappointment and pain. To protect yourself, you built a wall of self-sufficiency, vowing never to put your well-being in the hands of another person again. In adulthood, this looks like a refusal to ask for assistance, even when you are clearly drowning in responsibilities or emotional distress. Your default response is, "I'm fine," or "I've got it," even if your health and relationships are suffering as a result. The internal monologue of an invisible child insists that depending on others is either dangerous, because they will let you down, or futile, because they won't care anyway. The real-life consequence is chronic burnout and a deep, secret loneliness, as you have effectively locked yourself in a tower of your own making. By never allowing anyone to help you, you also never allow anyone to truly know you, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of invisibility. This hyperindependence is a hallmark of what attachment theory calls a dismissive avoidant attachment style. When primary caregivers are emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, children learn to deactivate their attachment system to avoid the pain of rejection. Research suggests this is a strategic adaptation. If you convince yourself you don't need anyone, you can't be hurt when they aren't there. In adulthood, this manifests as a deep discomfort with intimacy and a tendency to pull away just when a relationship starts to feel close. You might view emotional closeness as a threat to your autonomy, as if being known by someone else gives them the power to make you invisible again. This defense mechanism was life-saving when you were a vulnerable child, but as an adult, it becomes a barrier to the very connection you truly crave. You may pride yourself on being low maintenance, but in reality, you are simply maintaining a safe distance from other human beings. The real-life consequence is a cycle of shallow connections and a persistent, underlying sense of alienation. Number 3, a struggle to identify and express your own emotions. If you grew up invisible, your emotions were likely treated as non-existent or inconvenient, so you never developed the psychological tools to name them. Clinical psychology calls this alexithymia, a condition where a person has a profound difficulty identifying, describing, and processing feelings. When you are asked how you feel, you might experience a literal blankness or describe your internal state as a heavy, gray numbness. This isn't because you don't have feelings, but because your brain learned to disconnect from them as a protective measure against overwhelming neglect. Because you weren't taught to trust your emotional compass, you often default to logic, overthinking, and rationalization to navigate your life. In relationships, this makes it nearly impossible to communicate your needs, because you often don't even know what your needs are until you've reached a breaking point. The real-life consequence is that you feel perpetually misunderstood by others and alienated from yourself. You are living in a body that is constantly speaking to you, but you have lost the ability to understand its language. Number 4, social camouflaging and fawning. If being you wasn't enough to get noticed, or if being you caused conflict, you likely learned to become whoever the person in front of you needed you to be. Psychology shows that fawning is a stress response, a sister to fight, flight, or freeze, where you appease and mirror others to ensure your safety. As an adult, this looks like being a social chameleon, where you effortlessly blend into any group by adopting their opinions, interests, and energy levels. Cognitive psychology calls this high-frequency social monitoring. You are constantly scanning the room for cues on how to act. You don't stand out or cause trouble. While this makes you highly likable and adaptable, it is an incredibly exhausting way to live because it requires you to constantly suppress your true self. The real-life consequence is that after a social event, you feel completely drained, not just from the interaction but from the performance. You may find that you have different personalities for different people, and you fear the day these different worlds might collide and expose the void at the center. Ultimately, camouflaging is just another way of remaining invisible while standing in plain sight. Number 5. A persistent sense of being an outsider looking in. Even when you are surrounded by loving friends or a supportive family, you likely feel a profound sense of detachment, as if there is a thick glass wall between you and the rest of the world. Psychology shows that early neglect disrupts the development of a secure sense of belonging. If you weren't welcomed into your first social unit, your family, you struggle to feel welcome anywhere. You may feel like everyone else was given a manual for how to connect and be human that you somehow missed. Cognitive psychology identifies this as a core schema of defectiveness or social isolation, a deeply held belief that you are fundamentally different or flawed. This leads to a spectator mentality, where you observe life with academic precision, but rarely allow yourself to fully participate in it. You are often the best observer of other people's dynamics precisely because you are so far removed from your own. The real-life consequence is a chronic inability to feel at home anywhere, leading to a life of wandering even if you never leave your hometown. When these 5 traits are combined, they often lead to what psychologists describe as small life syndrome. Because you have learned that being seen is potentially dangerous or burdensome, you subconsciously limit your ambitions to avoid the spotlight. You might settle for a career that is well below your capabilities, because it allows you to remain unnoticed and unchallenged. In relationships, you may choose partners who are emotionally unavailable or overly demanding, effectively recreating the environment of your childhood. Research suggests this is a form of repetition compulsion, where we seek out familiar pain because it feels more manageable than the unknown. You avoid taking risks, not because you are incapable, but because the internal cost of failure feels like a final confirmation of your invisibility. Over time, this playing small results in a profound sense of regret and the feeling that your life is something that is happening to you, rather than something you are creating. Breaking free from this syndrome requires a radical shift in how you view your right to occupy space and be heard. Healing from the trauma of invisibility is a slow process of learning to reparent yourself and validate your own existence. Psychology recommends starting with small, manageable acts of visibility, like expressing a minor preference or saying no to a low-stakes request. Cognitive behavioral techniques can help you challenge the core schema of defectiveness by looking for evidence that you are, in fact, valued by those around you. Developing emotional literacy is also crucial. Spend time each day trying to name exactly what you are feeling, even if it's just frustrated or tired. Research shows that therapeutic validation, having a professional witness and acknowledge your pain, can be a powerful antidote to a childhood of being ignored. You must learn to tolerate the discomfort of being seen, understanding that the anxiety you feel when the spotlight is on you is just a ghost of your childhood survival mechanism. Visibility is not an act of arrogance. It is a fundamental human right that you were temporarily denied. The more you practice being seen, the more the glass wall begins to dissolve, allowing you to finally step into the world as a participant. If you recognize yourself in these 5 traits, please understand that they are not character flaws, but the brilliant adaptations of a child who is trying to survive in a vacuum of attention. You are not a ghost, you are not a burden, and you are not an outsider by nature. You are simply a person who was forced to wait too long for their existence to be acknowledged. The work of becoming visible is difficult, but it is the most important journey you will ever take. Psychology reminds us that while we cannot change our beginnings, we have the neuroplasticity to rewrite the middle and the end of our stories. You deserve to be known, to be heard, and to occupy space in this world without apology. The next time you feel the urge to disappear, remember that the only person who truly needs to see you right now is yourself. Take a breath, stand your ground, and trust that your presence is enough. Your visibility starts the moment you decide that you are no longer willing to be a ghost in your own life.